I did apply to law school. My mother is a lawyer. I did apply to law school. But sort of at the last minute, I made the decision of going to computer science. Decision, of course, I do not regret at all.
73 war started, and I had to go, and I was called to serve during the war. So you sum up all this time, all together, I spent about 5 years in the military. You have to compartmentalize. You put your science and engineering on the side, and you just do your military thing.
Being a Jew, my likelihood to ever be a scientist was close to zero. I wasn't even considering it as a career. You know, you're Russian, people will make jokes about your accent, and this would be all the time.
But even if I speak to them in English, when I'm sort of analyzing them, that's in Hebrew. And I can tell you that many, many times I've heard, oh my God, she's not like her father.
Both of my parents are Holocaust survivors. They met in what's called a DP camp in Germany. DP stands for Displaced Persons Camp.
You know, I couldn't believe it because they always say it's 1 in 8, but you always think that you are the 7th one because I never had any cancer in my family.
Welcome to the Immigrant Computer Scientists podcast, where we talk to computer scientists who immigrated from their home countries for study or for work or for other reasons. In these oral history interviews, you will find established and renowned computer scientists from across academia and industry narrating their experiences of immigrating from where they grew up to a completely different land, often the US. My name is Indy Gupta, and I'm your host. A nation that has existed for millennia, and yet a nation that has existed for only 74 years since 1948. A nation and peoples for whom immigration has been a way of life for millennia. A nation named Israel. Today's episode features oral history stories from 3 extremely distinguished computer scientists who immigrated from Israel to the US. One in 1981, one came in 1994, and the third came in 1997. All 3 were reluctant immigrants to the US, planning to return to Israel. And yet they each have gone on to become the top technologists in their respective fields, spanning academia and industry, and spanning artificial intelligence, machine learning, security, blockchain, natural language processing, and medical informatics. The 3 stories of our 3 guests, or narrators, are very different from each other. The subsequent episodes following this lead episode contain the full oral history interviews with these individual computer scientists. These oral history interviews are not intended to be a representative sample. They are just the personal immigration stories of 3 prominent computer scientists who immigrated from Israel to the US. While this episode features 3 ethnically Jewish guests originally from Israel, I must note that about 20% of Israeli residents in Israel are of Arab ethnicity. In this podcast, we have previously interviewed computer scientists who were originally from Arab countries in the Middle East. You'll find these interviews, where we visited Lebanon, Egypt, and Iran, in episodes 9, 10, 11, and 12 of this podcast. As usual, you can find all episodes and detailed episode guides on our website, csimmigrant.org. Again, that's csimmigrant.org. And you can find us and subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and basically wherever you get your podcasts. Now, while this episode is not intended to be a history lesson about Israel or the conflicts in that country, events in Israel's history are naturally intertwined with the experiences of our guests. So that you may interpret their experiences in a broader sense, I'm going to provide a little bit of context about the Jewish people and Israel. Again, this is not meant to be comprehensive. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, from the ancient times to the Egyptian kingdoms, to occupation under the Roman Empire around 0 BC, to occupation under the Ottoman Empire from the 1500s to early 1900s before World War I, and through diaspora spread out all across the world, the Jewish people sustained a dream of returning to their homeland in the Middle East. And yet, by the 1800s, there were only about 25,000 Jews left in their ancient homeland, mostly around Jerusalem. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, in 1947, the United Nations voted to partition the region into separate Jewish and Arab states. The State of Israel was proclaimed in 1948. Immediately, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq declared war on Israel. After surviving that war, Israel's first government was formed in 1949. Since then, until today, Israel continues to be a democratic republic with a parliamentary system of government, headed by a prime minister. Immigration of Jewish peoples from all around the world into Israel continued steadily in the few decades before Israel's formation in 1948, and this immigration became heavier after Israel's formation in 1948. And of course, most of our listeners know about the treatment of the Jewish peoples under the Nazis before and during the Second World War. Two of our guests today had their parents immigrate from Europe to Israel before they were each born. And our third guest herself migrated from Europe to Israel with her parents in 1990, making her a double immigrant from Europe to Israel and eventually from Israel to the US. Conflicts and wars, unfortunately, have become a part of the reality in Israel, often a fight for survival against some of the neighboring states. Israel has seen conflicts nearly every decade since its formation. It is inevitable that Israeli history and these conflicts will feature in the experiences of our three guests today. Two of our guests, one male and one female, were both involved in the front lines of fighting in the Israel-Lebanon War of the 1980s. We'll talk about that. And yet, the beauty of the country, its color, food, smells, plants, people, traditions, hold a strong charm for those who grew up in it. You'll hear this love for Israel in our guests' voices in this episode. Today's episode features three distinguished computer scientists who are also amazing human beings. Each of them has a very unique story. All three of our guests are currently professors at MIT, Rice University, and University of Pennsylvania, respectively. Two of these three have also worked a total of 33 years in industry. Two of the three did their PhDs in Israel and first came to the US for their postdocs. The third of the three came to the US as a housewife, and yet she went on to do her PhD and eventually became a faculty at MIT. We'll talk about that. Let's meet our three guests and hear their voices. Our first guest was born in the US in the 1960s when her parents were visiting from Israel on their sabbatical. Then our guest moved back to Israel at the tender age of 1, and then she grew up there in Israel for the next 33 years of her life. After finishing her PhD in Israel in 1994, she immigrated to the US for her postdoc with the full intention of returning back to Israel. And yet, for various reasons, she stayed on in the US. Since then, she has spent 23 years in IBM research, and quite recently, she became a university professor. She was also recently ranked by Business Insider as number 4 on the list of 22 most powerful women engineers in the world. This guest, our first guest, is Tal Rabin.
I did apply to law school. My mother is a lawyer. I did apply to law school. But sort of at the last minute, I made the decision of going to computer science. Decision, of course, I do not regret at all.
That was Tal Rabin, currently a professor of computer and information science at the University of Pennsylvania. She's also head of research at the Algorand Foundation, working on blockchain technology. She's highly decorated, being a fellow of the ACM, fellow of the AAAS, a fellow of the IACR, that's cryptologic research, member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the 2019 RSA Award for Excellence in Mathematics. That is Tal Rabin. Now on to our second guest. He was born in Israel in the 1950s and grew up in a kibbutz, that's a commune inside Israel. There are many of them inside Israel. And he grew up in a kibbutz during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. He also fought in multiple wars, including the 1980s Israel-Lebanon conflict. He did his PhD in 1981 in Israel. He moved to the US in 1981 for a postdoc with the full intention of, yes, again, returning to Israel. And yet again, for family reasons, he stayed on in the US, spending first 10 years at IBM Research and then another nearly 30 years to date as a university professor. He's won two of the most coveted Lifetime Achievement Awards in computer science research. The Gödel Prize in 2000, given for lifetime achievement in theoretical computer science, and the Knuth Prize, named after Donald Knuth, which he won in 2021 for seminal contributions to computer science foundations. This guest, our second guest, is Moshe Vardi.
73 war started, and I had to go, and I was called to serve during the war.
That was Moshe Vardi, currently professor of computer science at Rice University. He is also an outspoken proponent of change in the way the computer science community views itself. He is an ACM Fellow, an IEEE Fellow, a AAAS Fellow, a AAAI Fellow, Fellow of the American Mathematical Society, Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a Guggenheim Fellow. Again, that's Moshe Vardi. Our third guest is very unique. She is a double immigrant. She was born in the East European nation of Moldova, a small nation, and I'm going to pronounce that with the native pronunciation as Moldavia. Moldavia was one of the 15 nations or states that comprised the Soviet Union, communist USSR. Our guest spent the first 20 years of her life in Moldavia. At age 20 in 1990, just as the USSR was breaking up, she immigrated along with her parents from Moldavia to Israel. She then did her bachelor's and master's in Israel during the early and mid-1990s. And in 1997, she immigrated from Israel to the US as a housewife. Yet she went on to complete her PhD from Columbia University in New York City and then became a faculty member at MIT. This guest, our third guest, is Regina Barzilay.
Being a Jew, my likelihood to ever be a scientist was close to zero. I wasn't even considering it as a career.
That was Regina Barzilay, currently professor of electrical engineering and computer science at MIT. She is highly decorated. She won the MacArthur Fellowship, also known as the Genius Grant, in 2017. She's a AAAI Fellow. And in 2020, she was the first recipient of the $1 million AAAI Squirrel Award for Artificial Intelligence for the Benefit of Humanity. That's a highly meaningful award and quite tied to Regina's story. You see, in 2014, while Regina was a mid-career faculty at MIT, she was shocked to learn that she had been diagnosed with breast cancer. The story of how she not only survived this cancer, but also used it to motivate the next stage of her research career, computer science research dealing with cancer and oncology, is absolutely amazing. We'll cover that on this episode as well. This episode is structured into acts or chapters. You'll find chapter markers on your audio player, and you can use these to jump between the acts or chapters. In this episode, we covered the story of the early childhoods of our three guests. Two of them grew up in a kibbutz. We also covered expectations from family, society, and parents, their experiences with war and persecution. Language and culture feature in our acts. How research careers and choices often happen because of random chance. Computing in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, quite primitive but quite different from today. And how to overcome adversity and impostor syndrome, as well as comparisons to a famous parent. All of that in today's episode. Act 1. First impressions of Israel as an immigrant and growing up in a kibbutz. We can understand a little bit of the life in the community of people who immigrated from across the world into Israel in the 1990s by listening to the story of Regina Barzilay, currently professor at MIT. Regina was born and grew up in the East European country of Moldova, or the native pronunciation Moldavia. In 1990, when she was aged 20, she immigrated to Israel from Moldavia with her parents. She describes her first impressions of Israel.
You know, it was really beautiful. It was so very different from Moldavia because it was like sunny. The buildings were very different because, like in Moldavia, like at least in Chisinau, because it was all planned by all this communist government. It was very well organized, the structure and so on. Israel has a lot of flavor of kind of crazy Middle East, so it's like all these different buildings and like food. People sell it on the street, very, very different. And it was really exciting. I found a lot, I love plants. So I found a lot of plants that I didn't see that were, there was these different smells and different colors. And people looked very different because I grew up with an idea because where, I grew up, the Jewish people look kind of similar to how I look. But in Israel, there was a whole mix, there were Jewish people like from Morocco and from India, and they just look very different. There were a lot of diversity. There were totally different smells. So it was really exciting and scary.
Scary?
No, scary not in a sense. I mean, it was very peaceful times. When we arrived, it was a time that I think, like 1 million people, not Russians, I mean, I'm not Russian, but people from USSR moved within like 2 years or something to Israel. At the time, it was pretty tough because even with a desire to help, you have such a huge influx in the population. And it was really not clear to me how, we are going to survive economically. I came from a family which was, upper middle class family. And, I never really thought very hard how my parents, how the money comes. And all of a sudden, you're really starting in the very, very bottom. It's scary. And also I still remember, there were people on the street who came, from somewhere from USSR who were like playing music, and it's clear that it's classically trained musicians, or there were a lot of people who really would take any job that will pay the bills. And in some ways it's fine, of course we all need jobs, but it was such a humongous shift, and people, all these newcomers, on one hand, were very different from the native population. On the other hand, they tried to get into the society, and it wasn't an easy entrance.
Two of our guests, Regina Barzilay, professor at MIT, and Moshe Vardi, professor at Rice, spent significant time in a kibbutz. That's a commune in Israel. First, here's Regina briefly describing her experience in the 1990s.
And I went, when we arrived, I went to be in a kibbutz. Kibbutz, it's like a collective agricultural, commune where people, live together. They don't only do agriculture, they may have some small businesses. So I went to the north on my own after like a few weeks after we arrived. And I pretty much stayed there for several months until I learned Hebrew.
And here is Moshe Vardi, professor at Rice and Gödel Prize winner, describing his upbringing in a kibbutz in Carmel, Israel, and the really interesting story of why his family decided to leave the kibbutz. So you grew up in Israel in the 1970s and 60s and a bit of the 1950s. Those were very early days in your life, and also very early days in the nation of Israel itself, as the country was officially formed in the late 1940s. What do you remember about the country from your early years growing up?
I grew up in a kibbutz. A kibbutz was an experiment of socialism in the small, kind of a collective. Main focus was on agriculture and hospitality. It was a very idyllic place. It was a small, probably around maybe 50 to 60 family up on the Carmel Hills. So I have a lot of nostalgia for the place. It was, outside, once you step outside of the kibbutz boundaries, it was practically the wilderness. So it was, for me, it was a great place to grow up. I could never, I felt pity for my relatives from the city who grew up in the city. To me, it was the freedom of growing up in the country was was just the way to grow up. I mean, when I went outside, my parents never asked, where are you going? I just said, I'm going to play. Okay, go play. Just be back in time for dinner. And it was just completely safe.
And there was a lot of trust. It sounds like there was a lot of trust among the families in the kibbutz that your parents would just let you go.
Oh, yeah, they would let me go. They knew that I would be, they didn't have to worry about me. It was a classical thing that nobody locked doors. So I didn't have a key to the house. Why do you need a key? The house was open. So there was this kind of growing up. So this was very, very idyllic. But at the same time, at maybe around age 12, I decided to design a board game. And I designed a board game. And the board game, it was a 2-player board game. And one side was the PLO, and the other side was the PLO is a Palestinian Liberation Organization, and the other side was the IDF. And the PLO was trying to infiltrate and bomb things, and the IDF was supposed to stop them. The game did not prove to be very popular with my friends because no one ever wanted to play the PLO. But it's kind of, so the game was a bust in some sense, but to me it's kind of interesting. It tells me about the mindset of a 12-year-old boy who in this idyllic setting already worried about terrorism. So you can never get away from the security equations in Israel.
So this was a game of strategy that you designed based on, there's things you were hearing in the news or the things that you were hearing people talking. And what about the schooling? So was the schooling inside the kibbutz community itself?
No, the kibbutz was too small to have its own school. It had a regional school. Now, the regional school was just next to the kibbutz. So it was really, I don't know, half a mile away. I did not have to walk very far. Some other places, the children were had a bus. We just had to walk. So the school was practically in the kibbutz, but it was really a regional school for what we call the Carmel Shores.
I see.
It was a regional council.
Tell us a little bit about the kibbutz itself. So here, like today, now in the U.S., we have these communities of houses, and sometimes kids go over and have play dates and things like that. It seems to me that the kibbutz is a more tightly knit than that. Can you say a little bit more about how exactly the families are tightly knit inside the kibbutz?
So the kibbutz was really an attempt that ultimately, historically, and that will take an hour just to talk just about that, but it was trying to implement socialism in the small rather than in the large. So in the large means, basically it's what we call a centralized economy.
Right.
Okay. And here it's what people here would call in the United States a commune. Really, it will be the equivalent of a commune, economic commune. The people in the kibbutz essentially had an economic partnership, and so they own the means of productions collectively, and so they're all essentially self-employed, so to speak. The kibbutz was a partnership. The kibbutz owned all the means of production. We had fields, we have a barn, we have cows, we have at some point sheep, everything. We will have actually a guest house, and there was someone who was the labor coordinator, and he told people, this is where we need you now. So now you need to work here, and now you need to work there. And you got paid by family size, and it was not called even a salary. It was really more like an allowance. It was called a budget. And the budget was just a function of family size. Now that kibbutz was a bit unique. At that time, in the early 50s, in the mid to late 50s and 60s, kibbutzim in Israel also, it was an idea that ultimately did not succeed. The idea was to liberate women from a lot of housework. And therefore the children grew up, again, collectively. But this kibbutz I grew up with a family. So I grew up in a family.
So your parents, did they work in the kibbutz itself?
My parents worked in the kibbutz itself, yes.
And the food that you ate, that was cooked in a communal way by several people?
The food was cooked at home.
Was cooked at home, just your home itself.
Home. So we had unlike some other things, we had basically a family, my parents, myself and my siblings, we grew up in a home. My mother was in charge of cooking. So it was all in the context of a family structure, family unit.
And did your father, your mother, did they have professions that were related to engineering or science?
Not at all, not at all. So the kibbutz. So my mother had to do with hospitality. The kibbutz is a guest house, and my mother worked for the guest house. My father started actually as an auto mechanic. And at some point he said no. He decided he wanted a little more, and he asked the kibbutz to send him to a teacher seminary, and he became a teacher. For my childhood, I enjoyed much more to have my father as a mechanic, because that was fun. Tractors, machines, soldering, all these things. That was kind of fun as a child. A father who was a teacher, it was actually very boring.
Yeah.
But for my father was an important step in his kind of intellectual development. And in fact, after about 15 years in the kibbutz, he wanted to go to college. He decided he wants to go to college. And he went to kibbutz and says, I want to go to college. I'll continue to work, full-time job, and I want to go to college. And the kibbutz says, well, you want to go to college. That's very individualistic. This is a kibbutz here. We make collective decisions. The membership will decide whether or not you should go to college. And, you want to go to college, next thing. Everybody wants to go to college. We can't manage these things that way. So the membership will decide if you're going to go to college. And to my father, that was, he didn't realize being a kibbutz, it means such a loss of autonomy that he cannot pursue his educational aspirations.
Right.
And at that point, he basically made a decision, and my mother was not happy about it. But he was a tough man, and he said, we're leaving.
I see.
And he found a job as a teacher somewhere else, and we packed our stuff and moved.
I see. So you didn't even wait for the kibbutz to render their judgment on whether they would.
No, he did not even wait. He did not like the idea that the membership will decide whether or not he can go to college. He said, as long as I'm doing my job, he said, I want to work a full-time job and go to college. And they said, well, but the kibbutz will decide. And he didn't like this loss of autonomy.
How old were you at this time when you left?
I was 13 years old. So this was a big transitions for me.
So that transition must have been quite a bit of a shock, right? Because you grew up in a communal kibbutz and then suddenly you moved to this outside world.
Yeah, it was, but it's more than just, it's in some sense, the child loser, you kind of develop roots. And so I kind of take the fact that I kind of move around, the fact that at age 13, I lost my original roots. And the next place where I moved, I was there for 3 years, and then I moved. So I kind of, I didn't have what some people have. They grow up all the way to age 18 in one place. I did not have it. I kind of moved, and I I don't know, you call it my rootlessness. You either think of it as a plus or a minus, but I did move around, and in some sense I've been moving around. In fact, Houston is the place I've been living the longest.
Yeah.
So if people ask me, what are you? I should say I'm a Houstonian, but it doesn't feel that way.
Yeah. You've been there for 28 years at this point, at least.
Yeah.
This is the Immigrant Computer Scientist podcast episode titled From Israel, featuring immigrant computer scientists from Israel. Act 2, Parents, Mom's Influence, Finding Jobs as an Immigrant in Israel, and Family Expectations that you become a rabbi. First, we talked to Tal Rabin, professor at UPenn. She was born in the US when her parents were visiting from Israel on their sabbatical. Then Tal returned to Israel at the tender age of 1, and she stayed in Israel until she finished her PhD in 1994, in her early 30s. Some of you may also know that Tal has a famous father. We'll talk about him later on in this episode. First, Tal describes her mother's influence on her life as Tal was growing up in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s.
I did apply to law school. My mother is a lawyer. I did apply to law school. But sort of at the last minute, I made the decision of going to computer science. Of course, I do not regret at all.
Your mother was a lawyer. What effect did that have on you when you were growing up?
I don't think the law itself had an effect. But you should think about my mother. My mother today is 92 years old.
Oh.
And she had a career. For a woman her age, that was not the standard thing. So I think that my mother's impact on my life was really as a role model, as knowing that you can have both an impressive career and also take care of the kids. Of course, the taking of the kids was not shared equally then, and maybe still is not shared equally today. So I did learn that you can do both things if you want. And I think of my mother as an amazing mother, and she was always there and available to me when I needed. So you could do it and do it well. And I think that this was important for me when I was going through my career and had 2 girls, to know that even if I'm not there 100% of the time, because I do work and I invest in that I can be. Maybe I'm not the perfect mother. Most likely I'm not the perfect mother, but I can be a good mother.
What was a typical day like when you were growing up in like early school, middle school, a typical school day? What would that be like for you?
So I didn't study much. So, first of all, I'd be late to school because I love to sleep. And I lived 5 minutes from school, but believe me, I never made it on time to school. So that would be the beginning. Then I'd be in school. The school day was short, definitely at the beginning. Maybe we finished school at 1, 2, and then later at 3. That was probably the latest that school went on in Israel. And always friends, scouts. Those were the things that I loved to do. Studying, not so much.
Not so much. And then when you came back home, your mom was at work and your dad was at work.
So my father, in fact, many times tried to come home during lunch to eat with me and my sister if we were there. But we had a babysitter who took care of us. And in fact, I saw her about 3 weeks ago when I was in Israel.
Oh.
And she's still in touch with my mother because my mother had a profound impact on her life, on this babysitter's life. She was the daughter of my parents' housekeeper.
I see.
And my mother really changed her life. She ended up being in charge of English studies in Jerusalem. And really, a lot of this came from my mother's presence and involvement in her life. So she still keeps in touch with my mother and visits her. And so I saw her 3 weeks ago when I was in Jerusalem. And what I didn't understand at the time was that she was 12 years old when she started taking care of us in the afternoons. But she grew up with us. And on the next sabbatical, my parents took her with us to the US. So she was part of our lives in a meaningful way.
Tal's parents themselves were immigrants into Israel from Germany and Austria. I asked her what it was like growing up in Israel as a child of immigrants. Now, your dad himself immigrated. He was born in Germany and then moved to Mandate, Palestine in the 1930s. Did you feel that? Did you feel some of those immigrant experiences come in when you were growing up, or was that completely transparent from you?
No, it was completely nothing. My mother immigrated from Austria. same year, maybe both came, I think, in 35. They were Israelis to me. And in fact, to some level, I always complained they never spoke German between them. So I didn't learn German. And that's a loss. But my parents were just Israelis to me. And I never thought of them as immigrants. I think they came very early, and that was just eliminated.
Did immigrants into Israel in the 1990s find jobs easily? Regina Barzilay, professor at MIT, who moved from Moldavia to Israel in 1990 at age 20, talks about the experiences of her parents. Did your parents have an easy or difficult time finding new jobs in Israel?
Yeah, so my parents actually had very tough, like everybody else. So, my parents came after they were 40s. And at that time, the likelihood that you're going to work based on your, profession was close to zero, unless you have some connection or something like this. And I remember we found an apartment, in some city near Tel Aviv. And my father found a job. Like everybody feels we have to find something so we can pay the bills. And my father went to work in the gas station. And he actually worked on this gas station, I think, for 12 years. Working 12 hours a day because, every penny that will, he can bring, he will do it. And my mom, eventually we kind of found her job to be, I helped her, I went with her, a cashier in a supermarket, in a fancy supermarket. And she also worked there until her retirement.
Moshe Vardi, professor at Rice, surprisingly revealed that his father wanted him to become a rabbi. That's a Jewish religious and spiritual leader, sometimes a priest. This was in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. This is a fascinating story. When you got interested in math and science, how was your parents' reaction to your interest? Was it, yes, this is natural, this is normal, or how was it?
So I think my father was a little torn. So I come up from a family with a very long rabbinic tradition of I don't know how many generations of rabbi. But my father was actually, at the end, part of his educational journey was he became an ordained rabbi. He never had a pulpit. He was a teacher. He taught Judaism. But he was officially an ordained rabbi. And his father was, and God knows how many generations.
Yeah.
And so we actually kind of made a deal. After I finished high school, we made a deal that I would go for 1 year to rabbinical seminary.
I see. Okay.
And then if I want to go to university, I can go to university. And I said, okay, that's a fair deal. And I went a year for rabbinical seminary. It didn't change anything. I was determined to go. I want to study physics.
Yeah.
Computer science came a little bit later. First, I wanted to study physics. I was really into science, and physics was a hard science. So.
Yeah.
In particular, in high school, where we had the last 1 year of what we call modern physics. And there was relativity theory and quantum mechanics. And this was so absolutely fascinating. There was just no rabbinical school would be able to tear me away from my dream of studying physics.
And so your parents just bowed to your interests and your...
So they said, okay, he said, it's fair deal. You give it a try for 1 year. Then you decide. You say you're going to be, at this point, I was a bit young when I finished high school. I finished high school at age 16. So he said, okay, in a year you'll be 17. You should decide for yourself after that what you want.
This is the Immigrant Computer Scientist podcast episode titled From Israel, featuring immigrant computer scientists from Israel. Act 3. Persecution. Many of our listeners know that the Jewish people have faced persecution over centuries and over millennia. Sometimes the persecution is overt, like the Holocaust. Sometimes the persecution was embedded in the fabric of society in countries in Europe. We first talked to Moshe Vardi, professor at Rice, who says that his parents, originally from Central Europe, met in a camp for displaced persons So you mentioned your parents met in a displaced persons camp. Where did your parents grow up, each of them?
So both of my parents are from Central Europe, from kind of remnants of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So my mother grew up in Hungary, and she was involved in what's called the Hungarian Holocaust, which is at the end of the last half of 44. There is a Holocaust in Hungary. It happens very late, in the late part of 44.
Yeah.
And she lost all of her family except one brother that survived. My father was born in Romania, in Transylvania. Now, Transylvania was an area of because remember, we have the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then it splits.
Yeah. Yes.
So Hungary was thought that some pieces that went to other countries belonged to them.
Right.
So when Hungary joins the Axis, they get half of Transylvania, including the half that where my father lives. So both of my parents survived what's so-called the Hungarian Holocaust.
Yeah. Next up is Regina Barzilay, who grew up in Moldavia. Moldavia was one of the countries that was part of the Soviet republics, or USSR, the communist nations inside USSR. She grew up in the 1970s and 80s. In the 1980s, the USSR was starting to break up, and this severely affected life in Moldavia. We talk about that. And we also talk about the systemic discrimination against Jews that was embedded in the employment system and the political system in Moldavia. Here's Regina Barzilay.
The mess started in my last year of school when, on one hand, there was a perestroika and all these changes in how people thought and, kind of this taste of real democracy. But on the other hand, in Moldavia, the situation really became terrible because they started fighting for independence. And as a result, Russia stopped supporting them economically. And the trade between Russia and Moldavia kind of broke up. And as a result, all of a sudden, like from very organized, safe society, it was total mess. It was unsafe to go out after 5. Even basic things you cannot find in the store. People were without jobs and in masses because lots and lots of factories that were kind of building things in collaboration with kind of Russian counterparts in Russia stopped working. So it was really amazing. Within a few months, a society that was functioning became totally non-functional society, and everybody were leaving. So the Jews were going to Israel, to the United States. Russians were going to the main Russia. Ukrainians were going to Ukraine. So it was, I remember I had this phone book, and I would cross if the person is kind of out of reach because it was a physical phone. And all of a sudden, my book became like cross after cross after cross. And within very short time, everything changed around us. And I originally, when my parents started talking to me, because all my family already moved to Israel, all the other big family, I was very sad. And, I had friends and, I got used and I loved Kishinev. But at some point, it really was a new world. It's like you're staying in your own city, but it doesn't feel anymore like your own city. So I guess it helped with the transition to the next step. In Kishinev, for somebody of my background, the best type of career that you can imagine. You can be a teacher, you can be an engineer, but the most important part of life was actually to get married and find the right husband. So,
how did you mentally take that? Did you think, that might be a fine future for me? Or did you think, no, I definitely do not want that future. I'm going to work hard to prevent that from happening. What was your mental approach to that?
No, I don't know there's anything wrong with getting married, but the point is that this was a place where, your career option, forget for a second the marriage, but your career option, what you can do. If I would have stayed there, I would be a math teacher, or maybe I would be some, kind of engineer in some institute or something like this. The number of things that I could have done was extremely limited. People, of course, were doing their job and were very sorry about this job. But, I knew that, being a Jew, my likelihood to ever be a scientist was close to zero. I wasn't even considering it as a career. You kind of grew up and, that's what I can get. And I will try to optimize within this set of opportunities. That's how I thought about it.
So moving forward in your timeline, around age 20, around 1990, your family moved from Moldavia to Israel. This was around the time, as you mentioned earlier, that the USSR was breaking up and living in Moldavia was very, very difficult. And also it was around the time that Moldavia declared its independence as a republic independent of USSR. What were the conversations like in your family before making the decision to move? Or was it fairly natural just because everyone else, all your other extended family has moved? It's a natural thing.
So everybody moved. We were the last one. Everybody were moving. And also at the time, so we kind of decided we are moving, but then this war with Israel and Iraq started. If you remember, Saddam Hussein at the time threw some rocket into Israel.
Yes.
So there was all this mess. So we lived on the kind of empty house with everything else somewhere for months and months. And I didn't know when we actually can move to Israel. So it was this kind of situation that you are in, that you're not really in one place and not in another place. You are in between places. It continued for some time, and then eventually we moved. And I don't really, remember my thought process. I just remember this waiting, because you really don't know what's to come next.
Yeah, sounds like the family was in limbo for a while. You had packed up everything from your old home. You were ready to move to Israel, but then you were kind of stuck in the middle waiting for things to stabilize in Israel.
Yeah. And the worst part of it, the situation in Moldavia was becoming actually worse and worse every day. But that's, it wasn't, it's interesting that when I'm like remembering my time there's some periods which I really remember in greatest detail, but that period I kind of remember a gray period and living in an empty house.
So at that time, I presume you had already finished high schooling. What was your educational status at that time?
So I finished high school and I did, I think, 1 year in the university. I was studying math. I did 1 year in the university. And then, when we kind of declared that we are moving, I had to withdraw from university, and we were sitting and waiting until I can actually move.
So the university in Moldavia that you went to, what was the admission process to that? Was there an entrance exam, or was it just based on school grades?
So you need to do several entrance exams to get in. And it was, some of these exams were written, some of them were oral exams. And I got a gold medal. Gold medal means that you get, 5, which was the highest score in all the subjects. And if you get it all in an external examination, then you can actually get into the university if you get 5 on your first entrance exam. So you don't need to do 3 if you have this gold medal and you have the first entrance exam with number 5, then you are in. And the assumption was that if you're doing the oral exam, it's much easier to kind of kill you because you are Jew. So you really need to make sure that you're passing the written exam with full grade. And that's what I did. And it was very, very stressful to make sure that I do get this full grade.
So you knew that one particular kind of exam, the oral exam, would be much harder for you because of your ethnicity and because of your being Jewish. And so you had to excel in one, and that created some amount of pressure.
And got this gold medal, which was like an obsession from early age, because this gold medal is actually sort of your entrance to the university.
Right.
I mean, there were lots of universities and a kind of institution of high learning. Some of them were really not great, so you could get somewhere. But if you want to select where you want to go, at least to some extent, you really have to get, this gold medal was helping. So that's why I was really working very hard to get it.
Act 4. Conflict and Wars in Israel. Conflicts and wars have, unfortunately, become a part of the reality and daily life in Israel, often a fight for survival against some of the neighboring nations. Israel has seen conflicts nearly every decade since its formation, from the Arab-Israel War in 1948 to Palestinian attacks in the 1950s, Suez Crisis against Egypt in 1956, the Six-Day War in 1967, the Yom Kippur War in 1973, the Israel-Lebanese conflicts of 1980s. Two of our guests were in this war. We'll talk about that. The Intifadas in 1980s through 2000s. The Lebanon War in 2006. A previous episode in this podcast series discussed the experience of this Lebanon War from inside Lebanon. And more recently, the Gaza conflicts since 2008. Israel has had mandatory military service for both men and women. Two of our guests fought in Israel's wars. And even when they were not fighting, war certainly affected their daily lives. Moshe Vardi, professor at Rice and Gödel Prize winner, describes fighting on the front lines of the Israel-Lebanon War of the 1980s and of being whisked within a space of 48 hours from Palo Alto in the US to the front lines of war in Israel and Lebanon. Here's Moshe. When you were growing up in the kibbutz and then later in the village moshav, there were quite a few conflicts in the nation of Israel, and Israel is a pretty small nation that you cannot be very far away from where the conflicts are happening in the 50s and the 60s. Did those affect your growing up as a child and your family itself?
So, 1967, we had what's called the 67 War.
Yeah.
So it was before that we had the issue of dealing with terrorism, with the PLO, IDF. 67 was a very dramatic period. So it was a war, but it ended up very, very fast. We call it in Israel the 6-day war.
6-day war, yep.
And so that was kind of the first. There was another conflict in 56, but I was way too young, so I don't have memories of that. What happened?
The Suez Crisis versus Egypt.
This is the Suez Crisis. This is 1956, and I was very young, so I don't have memories of that. But 67 was a big deal. And a few years later was another major conflict, which was the 73 war. So two major conflicts. 67, I was still a teenager. 73, I was already at that point. So the way Israel has something which is similar to the ROTC.
Okay, I see.
Which is where somehow you combine military service with academic study.
Yeah.
So the normal trajectory in Israel is you finish high school at age 18, you go and you serve in the military for 3 years, and then you go to college.
Right.
But you can ask to start your academic studies. So in this case, it was interleaving of academia and military service.
I see. So you were already in the bachelor's program by then, by 73?
So I remember I went 1 year to rabbinical seminary.
Correct, yes.
And then at age 17, I started the bachelor degree. Okay. Then in the next summer, I had to do boot camp.
I see.
And then I go to another year of college. And then in the second summer, I also do military training. And then the 73 war started.
Right.
And I had to go, and I was called to serve during the war.
So you were on the front lines.
I was in active duty in the war of 73. After I finished the war, I finished college. I went to graduate school, did my master and PhD in Israel, went to the United States, came back to visit, and there was another war. It was the 82 war. So you sum up all this time, all together, I spent about 5 years in the military.
I see. So you served in the 82 war as well?
Yeah.
So I presume you saw action on the front lines?
I saw action on the front line in 82, yes.
82. Yeah. How was that like? I mean, you're a scientist and engineer by profession, and you're out there holding weapons. And
you have to compartmentalize. You put your science and engineering on the side, and you just do your military thing.
And I'm sure there were other army personnel too who had essentially come away from their regular lives as, and other professions were serving in the military.
So Israel, the way it works in Israel, you have many people who are reservists. So, especially for men, you do your military duty, let's say 18 to 21, you do 3 years.
Yeah.
And then you stay usually about your mid 40s and you serve in the reserve. And it's about 1 month a year. It's a significant amount of service. It's about 1 month a year.
Yeah.
So the way the IDF works is you have what we call the regular army. And army there does not mean like here. Here you have army and navy and
Right.
air force. Army means the military, the whole thing. But you have people who are on either regular, so either they are draftees who do the 3 years of service, or the people who sign up for more, so they're volunteer, they stay for more,
Right.
or they are reservists. And the bulk of the IDF are reservists. So these are really, especially all men in Israel, all men up to a certain age, are still in service.
Mm.
So this unit was a unit of all the reservists. I was still unique that I flew from the United States, and within about 48 hours I was in Lebanon. It was a very abrupt transition from Palo Alto to Lebanon.
This is in 1982, right?
Yeah.
Even women served in Israel's military. Here is Tal Rabin describing her experiences in the Israeli army in 1970s and 1980s. When you were in college and in those years, was military service required of women?
Yes, but before that, after my high school, of course, I went into the army. I was 2 years in the army. I'm an officer. And I had a lot of luck at the time. Women's positions in the army were terrible. Most of them were secretarial jobs. This has changed a lot in the past 40 years. But there were a few jobs then that were better. And luckily for me, after being a secretary for a time, I managed to go to officer's course, and then I worked as a social worker, which was a much more fulfilling position.
So you served 2 years in the army and you did social work and you left as an officer. Did you ever have to go on the field? Because Israel had a lot of conflicts during that time.
Part of the change is also that women were all in non-combat positions, which was true for me as well. And of course, to this day, maybe women are not 50% in combat. We should not exaggerate that things have changed completely. But so I never went on the field, of course. There are two things that I do want to say about it. Mm-hmm. One is that during my officer's course, the first Lebanon war happened. Yep. So they took us. There was a mess. It was a mess. They took us from the officer's course and put us on the border with Lebanon, with lists of names of guys. And we had to mark going in, not going in, going in, which is insane to think that this is the records that they have of who was going into battle. And I don't know what happened with those lists and how effective they were, but this is what it was. And it was on these big computer sheets that was one line white, one line green, one line white. It was, and we all these women, we just stood there, girls, what women, girls, and marked these guys who were going in. So that is one thing, my closest as I got to something related to the war. And the second thing is that my base at the time was in the occupied territories, beyond the 67 lines. And this meant that as soldiers serving in those areas, we had to have a gun and walk around with a gun. And just to tell you how things changed over time during my military service. At the beginning, I lived in Jerusalem, so I could go in the occupied territories through Nablus and so on. I could drive, and I would drive with this little rickety beaten bug that my parents had that could break at any moment. I would drive without any fear through these areas to the base. But during my military service, the Intifada started. And at that point, I could not drive anymore through these zones, definitely not by myself, without any protection. And then I would take the bus inside Israel territory, and then there would be a pickup place, and we would go in an armed bus to the base. So this is the deterioration of the relationships that happened. In fact, in a I served in that base for 1 year. So it tells you how in 1 year, it went from a situation that I felt 100% safe to a situation where I was just not allowed to do it anymore, which of course is a telling story about the situation in Israel.
Yeah. So in the 1980s, as you mentioned, the Lebanon conflicts and then the first Intifada affected you certainly. Did it affect your father and your mother and their jobs and careers?
No. Listen, it affected every Israeli, okay? There were bombings and of course your political opinions. You might have not been happy with what was going on and what the government was doing. So in that sense, it's a small country. It's not like the US that something happens one place and people don't know anything elsewhere. Yeah. You know about everything. Israelis are very involved in their political lives. And also because it's just a fact of life, right? If something's heating up in the Gaza border and you have friends who have sons who are there, it affects you. Everything affects you. And of course, as I said, we are not the only side who's being affected by these things. People on the other side are being affected as well. But my parents' jobs and so on. Oh, you know what? My mother, the office of the Attorney General's where she worked was in East Jerusalem on a street called Salah ad-Din. And at the beginning also, she could go there really without any trouble and any worries. But later on, sometimes this was tense. Oh, and another thing also, we loved to eat in the old city, in the East City. We were really people who enjoyed this cultural mix that existed. And these things did decrease with time.
Can you describe a little bit the ethos and the thinking among like your neighbors and your friends about just this instability that exists because of the conflicts? It's very hard to like draw parallels with. Certainly in the US, we don't have that. I mean, we don't have these years and years upon of conflicts, and certainly in other parts of the world, this doesn't exist. But from what you're describing, I'm understanding that it just became a part of your thinking that, yes, there is a conflict in the background. Can you describe a little bit how you get used to that?
I'm not sure you do. It's not exactly in the background. And as I said, depending on your political views, you might really also be very, very unhappy about what's going on and the fact that this is not being resolved in a proper way and so on. But I think that for Israelis, really, it's part of the life. And not in a way that, okay, yes, it's some process going in the background. It is up there, up front.
You're listening to the Immigrant Computer Scientist podcast episode titled From Israel, featuring immigrant computer scientists from Israel. Act 5. Language. Language in school, on the streets, and at home. And cultural differences and cultural shocks. First up, we continue with Tal Rabin, professor at UPenn and head of research at Algorand Foundation. She grew up in Israel in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. She talks about language. What language was your school education in, especially science and math? And then what language did you speak at home? What language did you speak on the street with your friends?
All Hebrew. And I have to tell you that I also studied all my math in the university in Hebrew. And sometimes now in class, suddenly I'm like, what's this word in English? I have no idea what to say. And then I have to ask the students, and God knows what they think of me. But Hebrew throughout. Of course, I learned English while I was on sabbaticals here in the U.S., but it was never spoken at home. We only spoke Hebrew.
So by the time you finish your bachelor's, master's, and PhD, essentially you had only spoken and done work in Hebrew, not in English?
I only spoke in Hebrew all the time. I spoke in English only when I was here in 3rd grade and 8th grade, and I did 1 year of college when I was 18. So those were the only 3 years that I spoke English. But at the time, there wasn't a lot of TV and shows, and there was no chat or anything. My life was in Hebrew.
That's a beautiful way of putting it. Now, when you think of ideas, would you say you think in Hebrew still, or do you think sometimes in English? Or
I always wonder, and I always try to test myself. So I sometimes realize that when I type a phone number in English, on the phone, not in English, which I'm reading from the website, I say the numbers in English. But I think that my thinking is in Hebrew, that I still think in Hebrew.
yeah,
Definitely when I'm thinking about my relationships, my conversations with people that I speak Hebrew to, but even if I speak to them in English, when I'm sort of analyzing them, that's in Hebrew. And I'm different in Hebrew. When I speak to a Hebrew speaker, I'm not the same.
what do you mean?
Somehow, I don't know to explain it, but I know that I'm not the same. Something about it, I express myself definitely better in Hebrew. My vocabulary is richer. I have more phrases that I say, and I think they enrich the way that I can speak. But also, I think somehow my personality is more rooted in that Hebrew, and I come across slightly different.
And then we rewind a bit to the 1950s and 60s. Moshe Vardi, who was a child in Israel during those decades, talks about language. Your schooling, your high schooling, middle schooling, and then also your bachelor's was what language? What languages did you use? Spoken language.
Oh, it's all Hebrew.
It's all Hebrew.
It's all Hebrew.
At what point? And I presume you learned English on the side too as a second language.
So Israel English is taught as a second language, starting from I think like maybe 5th grade. So it's very important. And English is a primary foreign language that people in Israel study. So most Israelis speak the semi-decent English. Okay, even they always said some English. I mean, after that, today also the people later watch movies and TV. So there are other ways to study English. But at the time, that's where you studied English. In fact, even though it's not English, but I learned to read the Roman alphabet before I learned to read the Hebrew alphabet, because we had an atlas. I don't know in what language it was, but it was written in Roman letters. I wanted to know what is this country, and I asked my mother to tell me the letters. So I learned to read actually the Roman alphabet before the Hebrew alphabet.
When you think research, or when you think of research ideas, do you think in Hebrew or do you think in English? No.
Probably mixed. I know when I say it's always, even in my thought, it's in English. It's mixed. I don't even know. I'm kind of fully bilingual.
Yeah.
How
long did that transition to using English take? Was it like gradual after you came to the U.S. for your postdoc?
You come to the United States, it's an immersion. First of all, you spend most of your day around other people who, even though Stanford, when I was a postdoc, it was very international, of course.
Right.
But English is the lingua franca. Everybody speaks English. That's your common language. So you basically start when you use the language, at all times, and then you write papers. Of course, you write them in English from the very beginning. My master thesis was written in English. My PhD had to be in Hebrew because they say it's a Hebrew university. Your dissertation has to be. My master thesis was in English, but my doctoral dissertation was in Hebrew. But I have not really written much Hebrew since then, so I'm not very smooth today. I was writing Hebrew actually.
And I asked Moshe about the clash of cultures after he immigrated to the US in 1981. Did he have to adapt to the US from the Israeli culture that he grew up in? He revealed something very unique about the way Israelis interact and talk. So in 81, you finished your PhD and then you immigrated to the US
Immigrated to the US. I went to do a postdoc in the United States.
To do a postdoc at Stanford. But culturally, were there any changes? Were there any dramatic things that you had to adapt to after you move to the US in 81? Or was it fairly smooth and you really didn't have to think about it much?
You always have to kind of to adapt. And there is a kind of cultural gap between Israelis and Americans. So Israelis tend to be very direct. So the Israeli are called, there is a term which we use called sabra, and it refers to the fruit of what we call it's a cactus with fruits. Cactus pear, I think it's called cactus pear. And it's a fruit, but very thorny. So the parable is that Israeli are sweet on the inside and thorny on the outside. So Israel tend to be much more direct. I mean, United States, the culture there is especially I would say the Protestant culture. Yeah. I mean, it's just all very indirect. And then Israelis come and they are direct, okay? And here at the university, I call things the way I see them. And very often the higher administration is not always happy with my direct criticism.
Do you find yourself interacting nowadays? Do you find yourself interacting differently with your relatives and friends who are Israeli or Jewish versus your other professional colleagues who are not?
So after you do learn to kind of to adapt, you do learn that I had to develop a bit more diplomatic skills appropriate for this culture. In fact, I had the Israeli postdoc, and he complained at some point that I was not direct enough. He said, you just have to tell me things the way they are. You have been too diplomatic with me. And so I said, well, maybe I've become more diplomatic than I realized. But again, if you ask people, usually they would mention, at Rice, we don't have many Israelis at Rice. So they will mention my directness, I think. But I think it has been moderated after many years of living in the United States.
Yeah. And Regina Barzilay, uniquely placed as a double immigrant, first from Moldavia to Israel in 1990, and then Israel to the US in 1997, I asked her to compare her two immigrant experiences with each other. So I want to ask a little bit about your experience, to compare your experience of the first immigration from Moldavia to Israel and then your second immigration from Israel to US. They were under very different circumstances, and of course the countries are also very different. Do you feel that the first immigration prepared you for, again, the culture shock that you would face in your second immigration? I
didn't think of it as an immigration because I was planning to go back to Israel, and still my family is in Israel. I'm very connected to Israel, so I cannot really consider that. I have dual citizenship, but I'm kind of in between the two countries, which is quite different situation with Moldavia that I never visited since we left. But the first immigration, it was really a culture shock. And part of it is because, the country was really flooded with these new immigrants, which were poor, which looked very different, which, didn't have kind of the polish of, people from more Western society. And, it's kind of bizarre to think, but there were a lot of people, on one hand, there were a lot of people who helped, like really helped. And I still remember there was a neighbor living near my parents' house. When I visited on the weekend, I had to write some very long paper in Hebrew. And I just came and asked the lady who lived nearby to help me, to make sure that I write, in the right language. And she helped. She just sat with me and helped when I, with the paper. People helped in many, many ways. But when I came to the States, I came in a different class. I came as, educated person whose at least husband is in PhD. I was going to PhD. It's all different things. When we went to Israel, I was in the very bottom of, kind of social, hierarchy. In a sense, people would, can say to you something because you're Russian, which was kind of funny because I wasn't Russian, but, you're Russian. People will make jokes about your accent, and this would be all the time. You will be considered kind of some non-refined person. And, one story that I remember, and I cannot leave it from my memory to this day, that I went to visit with my then husband, some friends of his who were from very educated family. And when we were chatting, a really beautiful house and a lot of books. And I took the newspaper, which was like New York Times. It wasn't New York Times, it was the Israeli newspaper, and it had the culture supplement. And I started reading it. At the time, I already, was doing my master's. I was a teacher, so my Hebrew was, pretty reasonable. And then the mother of his friend, who was a very nice woman, came to me and said, "Wow, Regina, I cannot believe it that you're reading it." I said, "Why?" So it's about culture. Like the expectation is that you would not even look at, like people kind of discount you because of, how you look like or because of your class. I didn't feel it in the United States at all. And this was the hardest piece to cope, because you are always in somewhat diminishing role, and you need to prove yourself that you are like others. And I think that in some ways, in the United States, at least, that's how I perceive it, there is not much pressure that you forget who you are and you're going to be all part of the same. That there is like Chinatown, and people in Chinatown can, speak their language, have their shops. Well, in Israel, due to the fact how the country was built, that, if everybody will stay the same, then there will be no nationality. There is this push to kind of be like Israeli. And I didn't feel it when I came to the US. I felt I could totally stay the same. Though there were some really funny parts that, but at this point, I just laugh at them. I don't feel in any way, bad about them. And the funniest story that happened to me was I went with one of the faculty. We went to a conference in LA, and we went to pick up, we wanted to take a cab to the hotel. So I went and asked the person in the information in the airport, where the taxis are. And that person started talking to me, and he talks very, very slowly, one word a minute. And, I am trying, and then my partner, who was with me, this professor, he kind of interrupted and said, no, just tell me. And then the guy starts to speaking normally. And I felt, wow, he's really rude interrupting, because maybe the person has a disability. But then the person started, speaking totally okay. And it's like, what happened? And the guy, because I have an accent so that I cannot understand normal English. When I was like 15 years professor at MIT. And the book that really resonates with me, and when I read it, it was like as if, somebody wrote parts of my life, is a book, Americana, by Ngozi, which describes, this experience when you are immigrant, but you're an educated immigrant. And she describes it as like a story in the book, which is very parallel to it, that when she entered some college, the heroine of that book comes and tries to talk to admission officers, and they also talk to her in a very slow and bizarre way, until she realizes that they actually talk normally to all the other people in the queue. So there are these funny things, but I never took them very personally.
Yeah, it's very interesting always thinking of the assumptions and prejudices that others have about immigrants. And I think that's where a lot of this comes from. And Regina Barzilay describes the challenges of not knowing English and yet giving a talk at a conference in Spain.
But I have to tell you that when I went and I gave a talk, what happened to me, I gave a talk in this workshop that, I couldn't really speak English. I mean, I can sort of speak English, but I could write in English, but I could or read, but my conversational English was on the weaker side. And what I did when I prepared my talk, for every slide, together with my advisor, his name is Michael El-Haddad, together with my advisor, I kind of wrote on every slide what I need to say. It was like
The script, yes.
yeah, so I wrote the script with these physical slides, which I had in my books, and I learned it, I truly learned it by heart, and I would repeat it like 10,000 times to make sure that I'm smooth. So, now, you give so many talks, like tomorrow I'm supposed to give a talk and NCI, I didn't even start putting the slides together. But I spent like days preparing for the talk. At any rate, so I'm arriving to this workshop and I see everybody giving such a fantastic talks, and then I'm standing up and I start going through my slides, and then in the middle of the presentation I forget the next word, and I stand and everybody look at me and I'm quiet. And it's maybe they thought that I want just to make a point, but I really got stuck in the middle of the sentence and I couldn't remember what is the next thing to say. And then at some point I decided that I should move forward since I cannot stand there quietly. So I just moved to the next slide where I remember what I need to say and continued my presentation. And this was like, I felt it's horrifying. I felt that everybody thought that I was total moron. But it was not the end. The next thing is that they told me that I have to be on the panel. So I didn't realize what panel exactly means. And then they put me with various researchers who were like senior researchers. I was just a master's student. And you're supposed to speak English on the panel. But luckily, in front of me, there was a man who just couldn't stop talking. And he pretty much took the whole panel. And God bless him, I didn't have to speak. So I felt really terrible. I really felt that I'm a failure. I was an embarrassment, and I really, I saw that it was pretty much the end of my academic career. But though I liked it very much, but I thought this is the end.
And how did you cope in the days after that when you have this kind of negative feeling that, hey, what I did here was a complete bust? But really, it's not, right? I mean, I think most of the presentation went fine. How did you mentally cope with that?
Yeah, so, it takes time. Time actually, helps you to address all the problems that you have in life. So, at the time you go out and the only thing that I did, the lesson that I learned, the amount of time that I spend preparing on the talk, for my next talk, I tripled that time. And I actually learned every slide independently. If somebody shows me the slides, I know what to say. Obviously, my English became better when I moved to the States, but this was my main lesson.
This is the Immigrant Computer Scientist podcast episode titled From Israel, featuring immigrant computer scientists from Israel. Act 6, The Reluctant Immigrants to the US. Our three guests moved from Israel to the US in 1981, 1994, and 1997. I was surprised to hear all of them say that they'd not really thought of themselves as immigrants to the US. Not because the culture of Israel and the US are similar, there are in fact many differences, but because all the three of them had planned to return to Israel at some point of time. First up is Tal Rabin, who moved from Israel to the US in 1994 for her postdoc and has since then stayed on in the US for the past 28 years and counting. Moving forward to you're nearing the end of your PhD. This is late 1980s, early 1990s, as you're finishing your PhD in 1994 from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and you're considering next step career options. What were the options you were considering at that point?
Oh, at this point, it was clear that I was going to do research. So, in fact, I was hoping to come back to Israel as faculty. And in order to do that, I needed to go and do a postdoc for 2 years. And I went to MIT. I did not fully understand that my then husband had no intention of coming back to Israel. And even when I finished my postdoc and he said that we were not going back, I didn't understand that this was permanent. And so I applied to IBM Research because I thought I will be going back in 2, 3, 4 years. And that's why I didn't apply to university position in the US. But my then husband, his name is Boaz, he was very unhappy about the political situation in Israel and the occupation and so on, and had no intention of going back, not when I finished my postdoc and not 2, 3, 4 years later. So that is why I stayed in the US. And in fact, that choice, because I didn't go to university, I ended up at IBM, and that was an amazing place to be. We had a fantastic team, one of the best teams in the world in cryptography. And we came there, we were all new. There was an original group who was more senior and it all left. And we were a new bunch of hires. I always said that I felt that we were like little ducklings, that our mother duck had left us. And we started this group and we became amazing, which was really nice.
Returning to your timeline, so I want to take you back to when you're finishing your postdoc at MIT and you're considering next steps. And you mentioned earlier that you wanted to go back to Israel, but that your then husband did not. And that's one of the reasons why you started at IBM. And then you stayed at IBM for quite a while. You stayed there from 1996 to 2019. Did you ever go back to your thought of, well, I want to go back to Israel still, or did that just like fade away after a while?
I'm not a person like that. When I want to go back to Israel, I will go back to Israel. This is how I live my life. I'm in the here and now on everything. So no, I can tell it as a fact that I wanted to go back, but now I'm not thinking about it. It's not because it faded. It's just because I'm not thinking about it now. And when I'll think about it and I'll want to, I'll do it. And now I have 2 girls here, so everything is different.
But it sounds like there is still a part of your mind that desires and wishes to go back.
My heart, it will always be in Israel. And as I told you, I'm an Israeli through and through, in my personality, in the way I form relationships. Everything about me is Israeli. And whether I'll go back or not, I don't know. But maybe when I get older, I'll spend more time there. I don't know. We'll find out. When we have this interview in 10 years, I'll tell you.
You were born in the U.S., so officially you were a U.S. citizen, and then you went back. Did you ever feel different from the other kids who were born in Israel, or was it just like, I'm an Israeli?
I'm completely an Israeli. Anybody who knows me knows that I'm an Israeli through and through. Sure. And even now that I've probably lived in the U.S. more than half my life, I'm still Israeli.
Next up is Moshe Vardi, who moved from Israel to the U.S. in 1981 for his postdoc, and then stayed on in the U.S. for the next 41 years and counting. So returning to your timeline, so 83, you finished your postdoc, and then after that, you spent a couple of years as a visiting scientist at IBM Research and also research associate at Stanford. And then in 85, you officially joined IBM Research at Almaden. So around the time you're finishing your postdoc, did you consider returning to Israel?
Oh yeah, I was already. I had an offer. I was all ready to go back, but I did have a relationship, and I had to make a kind of a life decision. Okay, and I did talk to my partner, and we decided, does it make sense to bring her to Israel? And eventually, I decided it wasn't fair to ask her to. I was already living there, and it wasn't fair to ask her to uproot her life, so it didn't make sense. So I made a decision, what was at the time one of the most difficult decisions for me ever, was to stay in the United States.
And third is Regina Barzilay, who moved from Israel to the US in 1997 as a housewife and has since then stayed on in the US for the past 25 years and counting.
My then husband decided, so he went to Cornell. He was a PhD student at Cornell, and he started there before I was still in Israel. He studied at Cornell.
I see.
And then I at some point I finished my master's, and then I had to go to Ithaca, New York, where you've been as well, and I was a wife. So I was a wife. And he kind of rented an apartment which was it's near the airport, which is like far from the city. So I was sitting there the whole day with my own thoughts and thinking what I want to do next. And at some point, so I found a job as a programmer, and I was doing it for a few months, but I realized it's not what I want to do. And then I was approached, I don't remember how it came about, but the advisor of my master's advisor of Michael El-Kadar was Professor Kathy McEwen, who worked at Columbia, and we somehow connected. She actually saw this paper. She luckily didn't hear me presenting, but she saw the paper. The paper was kind of getting some traction, and she suggested me to apply to Columbia. And I applied in the middle of the year. I started in Columbia in January 1998. And then just moved there and started my PhD.
That's a very interesting story, a very unusual way of entering the PhD program, because the typical story is do your bachelor's or do your master's and then you apply for a PhD. But you spent this 1 year essentially bored, as you said, right?
Yeah, it was maybe half a year that I was bored. It's not really bored. I was working as a programmer, but I was thinking, is that what I want to do? And I decided it's not what I want to do, and then I moved to New York and started my PhD.
Right.
And you asked me earlier the question, did I, if I would not end up being in the States, would I decide to do a PhD? I don't know, but it was just then I was in a situation and I made a choice.
Act 7. It's a chance I started this research. Even the most distinguished careers have humble beginnings. In fact, even random beginnings at times. Now, if you're a student, you might think, I like area X because maybe it's a hot area with a lot of jobs. Maybe I really like the area, or other reasons that you may try to rationalize your preference for a particular area. Yet, how we choose an area to specialize in, or even the act of starting to do research, can be random choices, often driven by chance occurrences outside of one's control. This was true for all three of our guests. First is Tal Rabin, who chanced upon the topic that eventually became her career. So then you go to the master's, and then how do you choose the topic that you're working on? Do you take to your topic naturally, or?
It's very interesting that you're asking about it, because just recently I got the Stock Test of Time Award, for the 30-year Test of Time Award. This is for my master's work. And Michael Ben-Or, who was my advisor, just gave me that problem. I knew nothing. And I had to read around and so on, and I worked on it. And when we got the award, in fact, it's not that I didn't know it before, but I sent him an email and I said, you had really changed my life. I mean, you set the course of my life by just giving me that question, because it made me want to do these things and the area, everything about it. And I'm grateful to him. Yes, yet again, chance. But it was a moment in my life that really, there was a split, there was a fork in the road. And it was just that, giving me that question to work on.
And so you got that question from your advisor, and you, as you said, you don't have any background, you're looking into it. What were some of the feelings in your mind, that I have to read a whole lot of stuff? How do I even start this? How did you navigate that?
What's lucky for me? This was 1986. How much a lot of stuff was there? There wasn't much, okay? In this thing, there was one paper. I managed to read it. And then really it was trying to think, but these were very new days of this area. And these papers sort of launched this area, which now is sort of known as multi-party computations. There wasn't a lot to read.
What excited you most about this life of research? Very early on in your master's, as you started doing research, what was it that made you think, this could be a career for me?
Something exciting about finding out something that wasn't known before. that only you know, that only you know for a moment.
The thrill of discovering new things.
And the effort that is exerted to reach it. That it's not a trivial thing, that you had to invest a lot of time, a lot of thought in it. And suddenly it's there. I remember that moment when I solved this problem. I know where I was sitting. And this is, I don't know how many years ago, I can't calculate. But I was sitting in the kitchen, in my parents' kitchen next to the radiator. I remember this because it was such a meaningful moment in my life.
And how did you react at that moment when you discovered?
I was thinking, it looks like I solved it. And it's funny, I was studying with a friend of mine and he was sitting across the table. And I turned to him and I said, I think I solved my problem. I remember this whole thing.
Next is Regina Barzilay.
During my bachelor's degree, I had an exam, I had a class, I remember it was called numerical analysis. And we had to work in the lab because I didn't have a computer at home. So, this was the first time I did MATLAB, and I took this class. And then what happened was I did my, I taught 1 year and I liked it. And then I started teaching the second year. I already graduated, I had a degree, I graduated. And then I realized that actually I don't quite see myself teaching until the end of my biological life. Because it's the same material, so whatever you teach this year, then you teach the same book next year. In Israel, at least at the time, there were clear rules, which materials you can use. So it's not like you can select a book and teach according to whatever you like. There's a textbook, you're teaching based on the textbook. And then I realized, maybe it's not what I want to do at all. It's fine. I don't mind teaching and doing something else, but not just teaching all the time the same stuff. And at the time, I was trying kind of to discover if I can go, because in my university, math and computer science were the same department. And I was actually asking, can I, is it possible for me to study or to take classes or do something in computer science? And they told me, because you already graduated with undergrad from our department, you cannot take undergraduate classes, but you can sign up for master in computer science. And that's how I ended up going to master's in computer science. And they told me you can take the same classes that you wanted to take, but you just need to write a thesis. And I said, okay. And it was at the time a small university. And I was looking around and thinking, who will take me to write a thesis? And today we of course advise our students that you need to look at, what kind of papers the professor writes and how are your research interests matched with them. I just remember I liked my teacher in computer architecture, and I really liked him. And I asked him, is it possible that you take me, as your student? And he told me, yeah, but my research is in natural language processing. I said, okay. I had no clue what is natural language processing. I said, okay, why not? And that's how I started doing research.
So that was your first taste of research. You did no research in your bachelor's, but because you wanted to study computer science, you started working with this person.
Forced to do a thesis. That's the beginning. Because before that, I never thought of doing research. Again, I was in this mentality, I'm going to be a teacher, until I tried it. And and at that point, I was pretty much forced to do the thesis because there was no other way for me to study computer science, and that's how I end up selecting natural language processing.
And Moshe Vardi, Gödel Prize winner and Nuth Prize winner, talks about how he selected his first problems. When was your first experience with research in computer science?
So master was a 2 year. Master was 2 years, and you're supposed to. First year was mostly finding, taking courses and trying to define a research project. And then the second year is you still take courses, but you do your research project, you write a master thesis, and you're done. And so I started in 1976, and then in the spring I take a theory seminar. In a theory seminar, we had to read papers and give a presentation. And the paper ends up with some questions. And the question sounded me very interesting. And I go to the professor. I said, these are really interesting questions. I'd like to think about it. He said, yeah, I'll be happy to advise you on this question. That's how it started. So the questions were there in the paper, and essentially my master's thesis was trying to answer these questions from the paper left open.
So you didn't have much of an experience doing research while you were in the BSc program. It was only after the
nothing.
program.
The BSc was actually, the physics was a very special major. It was such the course requirement was so high that it was considered what they call expanded major.
I see.
So you could basically, you didn't have to take a minor. So essentially I took, it was as if I took a major and two minors, because I did also a minor in computer science on top of expanded major. But I had no research experience at the time.
This is the Immigrant Computer Scientist podcast episode titled From Israel, featuring immigrant computer scientists from Israel. Act 8, Computing in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. The 1960s and 70s were prehistoric times for computer science. Moshe Vardi did his schooling in Israel in the 1960s and completed his bachelor's in Israel in 1974 and his PhD also in Israel in 1981. He talks of his earliest memory of programming and computers, when the entire university celebrated the upgrading of memory of the mainframe and the president came to celebrate. Listen on.
And I did go after that to the academic bookstore and found a manual of Algol W. And I knew Algol W back and forth without ever writing. I never wrote a program in Algol W. But I read the manual cover to cover, and I mastered Algol W at the time. But I never wrote a single program in Algol W.
Yeah.
So at that point, I was very clear that I want to study computer science. But the field was still academically was very, very young. In fact, the Bar-Ilan University did not have a major in computer science. They only had a minor in computer science. So I majored in physics and minored in computer science.
And this is very early days of the computational era, late 1960s, early 1970s, like you said.
So I remember where they had a big event that the president of the university came to drink champagne when the mainframe was upgraded into one megabyte.
1 megabyte.
1 megabyte was such a big event that the whole leadership of the university came to celebrate and reach this milestone. Then the mainframe now has 1 megabyte of memory.
1 megabyte is unimaginable today.
1 megabyte of memory. And the mainframe had 1 megabyte of memory. And that was an event, not that the sysadmins were celebrating. It was a university, I said the leadership of the university came to celebrate this 1 megabyte event.
What was the first computer that you used?
I think the first computer I used was the one in Tel Aviv University during this 2-week course. And I think it was CDC, maybe CDC 6000.
Yeah, and this was Fortran programming, right?
Fortran programming on punch cards, just this medieval period in computing.
Tell us a little bit about your experience with punch cards programming.
So I'll jump ahead a little bit to tell you about punch cards.
Yeah.
So remember that after in 1971, I go to do my military service.
Yeah.
And then I go back to let's see, I serve. When do I go back to college? I go back to graduate school in 1976. Okay, and to do a master's degree in computer science.
Right.
And we had a project to do. So I go to look for what I was familiar with, a key punch machine First of all, I wrote my program whoever writes today program on a sheet of paper. First of all, you write your program,
Right.
and then you go to key punch it. And I said, where are the key? And then finally, in a dark, a dead end hallway, dark hallway, I found a dusty key punch machine. I said, okay, I found one, and I sit down and I start punching the cards. And somebody walks by and says, what are you doing? I said, I'm punching the cards for my project. And he says, punch card. Nobody uses punch cards anymore. So I said, how do you enter your job? You use a terminal. Really? What is a terminal? So this gap that I had between when I took the first programming course, which was 1970, and just a few years later, the world has changed. The microcomputer was introduced.
Yeah.
NP completeness was introduced. So big theoretical revolution and big practical revolution. So I did not yet see a microprocessors at all, but there were terminals. Now if you wanted to submit a job, you had a terminal, and that's how you submit your job. So I had to learn how to use terminals. So somebody saw me trying to punch cards, and it was as if I'm doing my project with a hammer and a chisel today. Imagine you see someone using a hammer and a chisel to write a project, to write a writing assignment.
And this happened in just a space of a few years.
Very short. But this year, I think people don't realize the 70s was a big of, in theory, there was a huge change, the introduction of NP completeness. The paper was 1971. In fact, we just celebrated 50 years to Cook's paper. Yeah. And Gary and Johnson was 1979, kind of became the Bible that we all read. I read it cover to cover when I was I was a PhD student. So huge changes. Microprocessor was invented in the 1970s. So 70s were a big period of big changes. And in the background, we don't know also the internet was developed. Okay, internet was first 1969. So again, the major development of the internet happened also in the 1970s.
And Tal Rabin, who did her schooling in Israel in the 1960s and 70s and finished her bachelor's in Israel in 1986. Tal describes getting email earlier than most of the rest of the world because her dad was a computer science professor. Email was so rare in those days in the 1980s that it was monitored. Listen on.
And a little tidbit is that I have had email since 1983 because we realized that this email existed, and my father was half a year away at Harvard teaching. So we thought that this would be a very convenient way for communicating. That we understood. And the phone calls were really expensive, like a few dollars per minute. So I got email. Sort of the university agreed to give me the email so that I could communicate with my father on matters of urgency. Mm-hmm. One day, I'm called by the head of the department, and he says to me, I've been monitoring your emails, and I see that you are also writing personal emails to your father. This should stop. Think about it now. If somebody would come and say this to you, you'd flip. And it seemed like a normal thing that he was looking at my email, and the thought that you need to conserve on the emails because it's only for really important things.
Yeah. I guess there's two aspects there. One is that someone is actually reading and monitoring your emails. And then the second is, we need to save some bytes by not sending personal emails.
Exactly.
It's
phenomenal. Nobody would think about it today.
Such a different time in computing back then.
Yes.
What was the first programming language you ever programmed in?
Oh, it must be Pascal.
And that was in college? That was in university too?
Yes, in my introduction to computer science. This was my, as I said, first encounter with things, and I think it was taught in Pascal.
Computer scientists are often prone to thinking while sitting in front of a monitor. I'm sure you've done it a lot of times. However, both Moshe Vardi earlier and now Tal Rabin up next talk about the importance of doing computer science with a pen and paper. what was your creative process back then, and what is your creative process now if it has changed? How do you think about a problem? Do you like to think about it in the back of your mind as you're doing other things? Some people do that. Others just sit down and just work on it for an hour or so. How is your creative process?
So I don't know much about it, but I know that I need to be holding a pen and have a paper. Sometimes I never write anything, and sometimes I'll write like one word or two. But I do sit and focus. I sit and think about it, or lie in bed and think about it, but it's concerted thinking. I'm focusing on the problem. But definitely sometimes I'm walking on the street and suddenly I think, oh, here's a point. So it's really a combination of these things. And of course, I work with people. Not on my on that first problem. Then I worked mostly alone, and I spoke to Michael from time to time. But today, of course, I collaborate more.
Yeah.
And almost exclusively, most papers are with others, and so we also work together and talk.
Act 9, Adversity. When life throws unexpected curveballs. Regina Barzilay moved to the US in 1997 as a housewife, then got a PhD from Columbia, and became a faculty at MIT in 2003. In 2014, she was shocked to learn that she had been diagnosed with breast cancer. I asked her about her immediate reaction to this news and the long repercussions of that significant event on her life and on her career. Here's Regina. So moving forward in the timeline, I want to ask a little bit about your experience in around 2014 when you were diagnosed with breast cancer. The diagnosis for any kind of cancer is usually a very slow-moving process with many tests over a long period of time. You usually never know, okay, this is it. It's usually, okay, let's try the next test. How did you mentally react to that at that stage in your career where you're already tenured, you already have a research group, and you already have a family, but mentally, how did you react to that?
So this was like the biggest shock of my life because I was healthy. The only time I was in the hospital is when I gave birth to my son. And, I couldn't believe it because they always say it's 1 in 8, but you always think that you are the 7th one because I never had any cancer in my family. And I did mammogram. They told me go and do the mammogram. I did the mammogram, but I never expected that we were going to hear something different. So I still remember, I went to. So I did several mammograms, and then on the 3rd year of doing mammograms, I remember I went to Mount Auburn. This is a hospital. It's funny because Mount Auburn is both a hospital and the cemetery at Cambridge. So you need to qualify. It's a hospital. They're close to each other. It was a hospital, so I went there. And I remember they sort of told me, you have something, let's just in case go and do biopsy. And I said, okay. And I was really stressed. It was like tremendously stressful. And I don't think that I actually ever seen anybody who, and it's not true. I've seen some people, but I've seen some people, not very close people, but I've seen people, and it was very stressful. Then I did one biopsy. It was the end of April, and I pretty much knew what will be fully my course of treatment by the end of July. So there was something in the middle, but like by the end of July, I knew I'm going to have chemo, and I started my chemo. But until then, I didn't know. So it was really bizarre times. It was on one hand, I go through all these medical tests. I didn't say anything to my students because, I would tell them when I know what's going on, but I didn't know what's going on. And one of my students won Best Paper Award in ACL during the time. And, and they're so happy. And it's like, who cares? But I try to be nice, and I showed my excitement. And then, you just go. The hardest part is actually when you don't know, because once you have like physical pains and stuff, but at least the course is clear.
And so at any point, did you think that did you think that, maybe I only have a few years left, or was the course of the treatment clear to you from the diagnosis point?
So you really don't know. You really don't know. Like at the moment that you hear the word cancer, you hear this is the end, and you stop believing the doctor, because what is your chance? Your chance is tiny, and all of a sudden they tell you have it and say it's 99% that you're fine. What exactly does it mean? I was that tiny percent. So you stop believing the numbers. You forget probability as applied to you, and you always expect the worst. And first it's like there are periods. There is a period when you try to understand what exactly do you have, because it takes a while. You need to do some lumpectomy, they analyze it, whatever. It takes a while. You kind of leave to the next test, to the result of next test. Then when that part is done, when the real serious chemo starts, you are really in a messed up state. I think in the following way, because you don't know what's to come on one hand. On the other hand, usual life, as when you just go to work and you do your stuff and you go back, is sort of messed up. But the treatment in some ways kind of consuming, that you, at the end, you just need to do one day at a time. And that's what you do. You do one day at a time.
There are many professionals who are cancer survivors, and as you said earlier, there is no manual for how to deal with this. Are there things you learned through your experience, things that you did right or things that you didn't do, that you would recommend our listeners if they ever have to face such a situation?
I don't think that there is a universal advice, because people deal with these situations in a very different way. And I think I was really, for better or for worse, I was already, in 43 when I got it. And I feel, this experience extremely matured me. And maybe, the listeners are much more mature than me at age 43. It really changed my understanding and perception of the world. There is a period when you feel it very acutely. As again, time is a healer. When time goes by, things change. But there are still, a lot of parts that, it just changes how you look at the rest of your life after, after going through this experience. And, and the part that, you kind of discover there is this other world, because when we are living in academia, we are totally stressed. Or is the paper getting in? Or did I get this grant? Or did my student get this job or didn't get the job or whatever? This is really, really important. And you need to be really serious about it, correct? To really push the boundaries and really think very hard about the problems. And in some ways, I think I would say I wouldn't say we, I would say I, infantile, because, you live in this kind of artificial world where a lot of real problems of real people are really never enter your life, because you have a very organized life. Of course, there is a stress in papers and when you become a patient, you all of a sudden see a different reality. You go, these treatments like radiation and other, happens every day. You see these people, you see a lot of sick people. You're like, how come I didn't know that these communities exist? I was not aware, the suffering and how it impacts people and how fragile we are. So this was my big eye-opening when I went through this treatment. And it's funny because MIT and MGH are just, it's a 15 minutes walk, one subway stop away, but such a different world.
Yeah, certainly your experience changed the kinds of research problems that you work on, your work with MIT Jameel Center and your other work that is about oncology. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that work that you've been doing recently?
Yeah, so actually when I came back, I really it was rethinking, you coming back to the world, your hair starts growing back, but it takes much longer to actually become your normal self. And I started asking myself, how come I'm doing this stuff? And one of the topics that I really like is working on undeciphered languages, which doesn't have any practical meaning whatsoever, but it's really, intellectually extremely interesting task. And I did some work. I really enjoy reading about it. And I was thinking, what is my right to work on this when there are lots of people who, don't benefit from technology? And you discover how much technology doesn't enter this world when you're part of that world. Because you can't imagine even the simplest question that you want to ask, tell me what happened to the patients like me in this hospital. They can give you some general statistics. But if you want to ask if women of this age with this particular, what happened? Even the information is electronic medical record, like what's the problem? People cannot do even that. So there are a lot of things that they cannot do that they should be doing. And many times you as a patient, you can say, oh, you can do A or you can do B. It's up to you to decide. But how can you decide if you don't have the information to make the decision, correct? And at that point, when I came back, I felt, it's like I was not interested in NLP. I still had a group but my mind was like, what can I do to change it? It was like, I went through it. I have a mandate. I have to change it. And then I started going around and around these places and asking different doctors, what can I do? And typically, being, a professor, you kind of, you're like a prima donna. You come, thank you so much that you want to work with me. Here I'm playing, knocking on all the doors and nobody cares. And it's like, we're doing great. Thank you very much. And it took me a while until I found, what I can do to make, to what I felt to make a difference. And since then, I pretty much changed the whole direction of my research because it's not only about like taking the tools that we've developed and applying it to medical data. You really need to have absolutely new machine learning algorithms to solve the real problems, not just to do something. You can do something. There are a lot of problems that you can solve just by taking what is out there and applying it. But there are like millions of problems for which we don't have a good computational solutions. And, and the longer I am in it, the more I see these big issues.
It's very interesting. Changing a research area is always tough, and changing one to a very applied research area is even tougher. And as you said, you went and knocked on many doors before you finally came to, I guess, a set of problems you wanted to work on and a set of people who would work with you. I guess the takeaway for me is to be persistent from your experience.
So I want to correct you. What I actually thought to myself, and that's why I never worked on clinical NLP or whatever, because I thought it's like apply thing. It's like people who cannot, it was really obnoxious of me to think so. I said people who cannot really compete on the methods in NLP, they just take an existing tool in NLP and apply it to medical records and get it on paper. This is not the case. Okay, you can do it and you can even get out something. But like if you're thinking, like in 2017, one of the topics that I studied I studied in 16, but in 17 there was the first paper. Tommy Yakala and I and our students at MIT, we started working on modeling small molecules. And this area was really not part of kind of core machine learning. We know that in machine learning, there are methods, there is natural language processing, there is computer vision. There was even, sequencing stuff. But modeling the molecules and their properties and other things, it wasn't there. I had to beg my students to work on it because they said, it's not really machine learning. And since then, this field really grew, and there is a lot of new methods work. How do you represent correctly the molecules? Is graph convolution is the right way to go. We've seen the amazing advancement that happened on the on the protein modeling. So this is a very, very active field that really changes. Super exciting field, and it's not. It has an application, but research itself in this field is actually very much methods driven. And in this case, the reason I think I could jump into it relatively easy because the field didn't really exist at the time. This was a similarity with NLP, that when I entered NLP, it was at the moment of the transition. So it happened to be that in chemistry slash drug design with deep learning, this was the field that was really on the earliest stages. And I actually, when I started working with it, I didn't even connect it to the drugs because I was in this exploratory stage. I said, I don't know what I want to do. And Professor Klaus Jensen, who is a professor in chemical engineering, approached me. He was introduced to me by my then department head, Silvio Michali, who is a Turing Award winner. He introduced me to him because I just needed some machine learning person on their DARPA grant related to how to do retrosynthesis, which means to identify the path of generating molecule. And I thought, okay, why not? I will try. And when I started talking and looking what is available, Tommy, who from the beginning worked with me and was a collaborator on the grant, we realized it's really a humongous opportunity here in terms of algorithms, and maybe doing it for a year or two. I look from my window and now I see, from my window, I see Amgen, I see Novartis, I see Moderna from a window from MIT. I realized, why wouldn't we connect it to actually drugs? There was a connection. Because I was working on imaging and predicting cancer from mammograms and other things, but then I realized it's also a potential to do it for therapeutics. And that's how we, kind of pivoted this work into the therapeutic area. So, when I'm looking at this path, it was kind of really not direct path. When I committed to work on, on cancer, I thought cancer is, NLP extraction from medical record. It's, deep learning from images to predict, progression of the disease or to predict who is going to get the disease. I didn't even connect this work. It took me 2 years to connect it. But now this is kind of most of what I'm doing today.
That's amazing that you've been able to convert that motivation into really, really useful research program. You're listening to the Immigrant Computer Scientist podcast episode titled From Israel, featuring immigrant computer scientists from Israel. Act 10, Imposter Syndrome and the Human Tendency to Compare People to People. The dreaded imposter syndrome, when you feel like a failure even in the midst of success, like you don't belong to your work community, like your talents and skills are just out of place in your workplace, like you are basically an imposter. Many technologists in academia and industry, as well as entrepreneurs, suffer from the imposter syndrome, sometimes acutely, sometimes chronically, sometimes occasionally. It is known to be common among women technologists. And closely related to the imposter syndrome is the human tendency to compare oneself to others, and the tendency of others to compare you to others. I spoke with two of my guests about this phenomenon. First up is Regina Barzilay. She has an extremely unique philosophy to handling imposter syndrome, one of the most unique philosophies I've ever heard.
The way, when I was younger, I did feel it many times. And I remember when I came to MIT, I knew that Shannon was a professor here, very scary. It's like, wow, are they all like Shannon here? I'm definitely not Shannon. There were all these questions, do I belong to this institution? But I think that what happened later to me, it's like I am now thinking I have goals, okay? So I have goals. I know what I want to achieve. So my point is, I am what I am now, correct? I really care to get where I want to get. And I am just a vehicle to bring, to bring the group to this particular point. Like, for instance, we have a lot of diseases like cancer, so there is really no treatment. They're lethal. And despite, all the big words that we are saying about AI and healthcare, we really didn't change anything in terms of mortality outcomes and drugs. So there are several areas where I think I have some ideas, my students have some ideas that we believe we can change it. So that what really occupies my mind, how I can make a difference there. It's, who cares if I am smart or not smart? This is irrelevant. My thinking is, would we be able to push it through? So again, but it came with an age and the purpose.
That's such an interesting philosophy, thinking of oneself as a vehicle for a certain kind of research or a certain kind of work to succeed. That philosophy kind of removes the I out of the situation, and essentially it addresses the imposter syndrome, but also addresses other things, and it gives the persistence and the energy to keep moving forward. It's a very interesting philosophy. Next up is Tal Rabin. her father, Michael Rabin, who's still alive, by the way, as of February 2022. He was a winner of the Turing Award, considered the Nobel Prize in computer science. He won that award when Tal was still a little girl. I first asked Tal about her perspectives on her father and his accomplishments. Your father was Michael Rabin, who was also an internationally prominent computer scientist, and he actually won the Turing Award, which is considered the Nobel Prize of Computer Science, in 1976. What was your experience like growing up with your father? Did you realize that he was such an accomplished computer scientist? Did that drive you? How was it in your early years?
Of course, as a child, I had no idea. But my father, at some point, and for him, at a young age, he started getting awards. By the way, in 76, when he got the Turing Award, I didn't even know. It's not that this was something that was so big in the family and I was young and I didn't even know. But later on, he got some prizes when I was already aware of them. I think that really understanding the magnitude of my father's work and its impact on our society, on our digital society as we know it today, I think really came with understanding the technical material more. You can be told, oh my God, these results are amazing, and you can understand it on some level, but that it's amazing. But really, really, the depth of it came with the learning and the education that I got, which of course started in the university. And I think it's something very special for a child to understand what their parent does on such a deep level. And in fact, my dad just celebrated his 90th birthday.
Wow.
And there was an academic celebration in Jerusalem. And I spoke about that. And in preparation of this work, I again had this feeling that, just comes into your heart in a deep, deep way. And it's wonderful.
And Tal also spoke about the feeling that one needs to overperform as a woman in the computer science and technology field. And a particularly sensitive topic came up when others brazenly compare Tal to her own dad. Mind you, Tal is a highly successful computer scientist in her own right, and yet some just can't help it. Listen on.
And I can tell you that many, many times I've heard, oh my God, she's not like her father.
Yeah.
Then I would always think, and you are like my father? I mean, really, how many people are like my father? So what are you comparing? And on some levels, it's also true in the comparisons between other researchers.
Yeah.
And these comparisons, people would say the worst things to me. Yeah. For example, my father became an IACR Fellow. And he didn't come to the conference at that point. He was really, really senior. And he asked me to give, and I was there at Crypto, and he asked me to give this IACR acceptance on his behalf. And he always was a great speaker, and he wrote a beautiful speech, and I gave it. Yeah. And afterwards, somebody came to me and said, and I was already an established researcher, much better than the guy who came up to me. And he says to me, you really need to get from underneath the wings of your father. So, not only am I a woman, I also have a very famous father.
So did your approach to handling that question when it comes up, when the first few times that it came up in your life, were you just shocked by it when someone came up to you and asked you?
I think I was very aware from the beginning that this was a ridiculous comparison. But again, it's also part of my personality, I think, being able to take it this way.
Do you say something aloud and explicitly to the person, or do you just handle it mentally, internally, when it comes up?
Most times I don't say anything. That guy, by the way, came and apologized later.
I see.
I don't know if somebody in the circle had said something to him or he just realized what a complete idiot he was. But as I said, really, those people, they're better. So,
It's amazing that you're able to process it internally without actually saying anything aloud to the person.
It's also for my love for my father.
Act 11, Alternate Paths. In the last act of this episode, I asked each of our three guests a hypothetical question. First up is Tal Rabin, professor at UPenn, who grew up in Israel from the 1960s to the 1990s and immigrated to US in 1994 for her postdoc. My last question is a bit hypothetical, but I'm going to ask it. You were born in the US. Imagining that you had stayed in the US and had grown up through the US educational system, early school, middle school, high school, and university here, and everything else being equal, your personality, your life, your family, your parents, do you think your life and career may have evolved differently than what it did?
I think that, as I said, there were lucky points, right? At the end of my bachelor's, the problem that Michael gave me.
Yeah.
So I don't know if those two determining facts would have happened in another path. I don't know if there could have been something like that. I don't know. But I think I would have been different. I would have not been me had I not grown in Israel. My life in Israel, the relationships, the country, the smells, the sun, everything, the food, it's me.
That is so beautiful. Next up is Moshe Vardi, professor at Rice, who grew up in Israel in the 1950s to 1980s and immigrated to the US in 1981 for a postdoc. My next question is a little bit hypothetical, but I'll ask it anyway. So you grew up in Israel, and then you did your bachelor's, master's, and PhD there, and then eventually you moved here to the US and you stayed here. If in a parallel world you had been born in the US and you had gone through the US educational system, all else being equal, you're the same person, you have the same kind of family. Do you feel like your career and your life may have been different? And again, this is a hypothetical question.
It's kind of not completely hypothetical in the following sense that both of my parents are Holocaust survivors.
Mm.
They met in what's called a DP camp in Germany. DP stands for Displaced Persons Camp. The Allies. There were so many people who were displaced in the war that the Allies created the places where these people can come and settle down and then figure out where are they going to go from here.
Mm.
So my parents met in a displaced persons camp. And my father wanted to go to America. America was to be the golden state, the golden country. You go there and life is good. Israel was no Israel yet, and there was fairly clear it's going to be a war.
Yeah.
And in fact, my mother had a brother, and he lost his wife and daughter in the Holocaust. And he said, I cannot stomach another war. And he came to the United States.
Mm.
And my mother said to my father, we're going to go to Israel, to Palestine. And they went to Palestine and had to fight a war. They came to Israel. My mother in late 47, my father in early 48.
Mm.
And there was a war. They had to fight in what we call the 48 war. We call it the War of Independence. Okay. But I could not so far to imagine a scenario where they decide to go to America. Okay.
Right.
And I'm born in America. I think growing up in Israel probably gave me, there is a phrase, tough time make strong men, strong people. Strong people create successful times. Successful time create weak people. Weak people create hard times. Okay?
It's a full cycle.
It's a cycle. So growing up in Israel, as I said, having to, as a child, dealing with terrorism, like from age 12, the realization that there's some people who want to kill me. Yeah. And this, you can think what you want about the conflict and what to do about it, but the reality is, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. It is someone traumatizing, and I'm sure it is also traumatizing to Palestinian children. I'm not trying to take any of this away. Okay, but going like that, serving in the military, where you learn both discipline and responsibility, and also leadership. I mean, it's hard for me to separate who I am I mean, yes, of course there is. We all know about this nature versus nurture, but the answer it is both. Yes, I come to the world with a certain genetic imprint, and this genetic imprint is just potential to do certain things. Will you do these things or not?
Right.
Okay,
Right.
so it's very hard to say what I would be like. I mean, here, for example, especially in academia, I have leveraged my academic freedom and tenure, and I had very open disagreements with the administration here,
Yeah.
and I did not shy from such very open disagreements. I have tenure, but again, I mean, it's just not, I know other people with tenure that wouldn't do that. So I can't tell you exactly, but I said, this is, people tried to kill me before, so this is not so bad. They're not going to kill me. They're upset at me. They're not going to kill me.
Yeah.
I won't get a raise. It's not so bad as being killed. So you cannot separate. You grow up in Israel, and it shapes me as I am.
We end with Regina Barzilay, professor at MIT, who as a double immigrant has a most unique viewpoint on this hypothetical question. Again, she grew up in Moldavia in East Europe from 1970 to 1990, moved to Israel in 1990, stayed there until 1997, and immigrated to the US in 1997. Here's Regina. The next question I want to ask is a little bit hypothetical, but I'll ask it anyway. So you grew up a little bit in Moldavia and then a little bit in Israel, and then finally you immigrated to the US. Did you ever think that, hey, if I had grown up in one country, maybe if I'd grown up completely in the US, all else being equal, me being the same person, maybe my life and career may have been very different. Or if I'd grown up completely in Israel from when I was a child, my life and career may have been different. Is this something that you ever thought of?
I don't think about that, but what I do think about sometimes is like, I think I was very privileged that I've seen so many different people in different countries and different attitudes, and they definitely all shaped my understanding of the world and helped me to be robust, in all these different situations. But the part that I am sort of lacking, I feel that, there are big parts of my life that's how we started our interview, that, Kishinev lives in my head. It doesn't look like what is in my head for decades already. And there are parts that are totally remote. I do not, I cannot go to the school where I studied. I cannot connect to the people with whom I grew up. And that's what I really miss. I'm always wondering, how are they doing? And I remember some gardens that I really loved. I'm always thinking, how are these gardens? There is this feeling of something, this nostalgic feeling that I have in me. But on the other hand, I'm thinking that somebody who even grew up in Boston, Boston doesn't look today what it was in the 70s. So this is what I miss. And I also sometimes, think that people who grew up in one place, they can connect to the place in a very different way than those of us who are replanted to these places. And, and I was always wondering, how is it if you're really grounded in your environment and you have all these connections and you know exactly, what this person was doing 10 years ago, which I typically don't. So, but it's just, one of the pathways that could have happened. So.
This was the lead episode on immigrant computer scientists, titled From Israel, featuring 3 distinguished immigrant computer scientists who immigrated from Israel to the US. What you heard on this episode were merely excerpts. Coming up in the next episode, next week, is the full interview with Tal Rabin, professor at UPenn and head of research at Algorand Foundation. Also ACM Fellow, AAAS Fellow, IACR Fellow. She spent 23 years at IBM Research before recently becoming a university professor. And she's the daughter of a Turing Award-winning father and also has a successful lawyer as her mother. Hear her full interview and story in its entirety, coming up next week. After that, we're going to have individual episodes featuring the full interviews with Moshe Vardi and with Regina Barzilay. Stay tuned. All the music used in episodes of the Immigrant Computer Scientists podcast is royalty-free. All voice recordings were performed with and are reproduced with full consent of narrators and participants. You can find music credits on our website. Join the online discussion about this podcast on all major social media, including Twitter and Facebook, with the handle CSImmigrant and hashtag CSImmigrant. And of course, the episode guide is available at our website, csimmigrant.org. This is the Immigrant Computer Scientists Podcast.